It's really great to have these perspectives. So now if people will line up on each side, we can have questions. I guess while we're waiting, well, we've got somebody already queued up. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I had two questions, actually. One for Jonathan Kimmelman and one for Health News Reviews and A Sense About Science. For Jonathan, I found the suggestion of the forecast idea very, very interesting, although I'm not sure I'm probably grasping exactly how it would work. So I'll start with a comment and then I'll turn that into a question, and I'll be brief, I promise. So what I don't quite get in that scheme of sort of the traditional scientific method is that I'm not sure I agree, I guess, with the point that prediction is lost in science today, in the sense that particularly if you think about biomedical research, in my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, but every paper, in a sense, that's reporting an empirical result, most often than not at least, was actually testing a prediction. In a sense, you start a study because you expect something to work or to do, something to happen, and you verify whether that's the case or not. So the prediction is already there, and I'm not sure, therefore, what the forecasts are supposed to be about, that a scientist would be in a position to make, to foretell, other than the science is doing. And for the public communicators, I would say, knowing that much biomedical research often deals with topics that are socially charged or ethically sensitive or politically charged or sensitive, and you're sure very familiar with all these difficulties. If you do have mechanisms in place, how do you ensure that your own biases or your own staff's biases don't actually enter into the process of communication? Thank you.
Ron, you want to go first?
Yeah, so a real challenge to get two talks that need 20 minutes each into 10 minutes. So thanks for the opportunity to get another 3 minutes to explain the scheme that I proposed. So I think if you read the introduction section or the discussion section of pretty much any scientific report and you actually try to interpret what the predictions are within the report, you're going to have a tough time. Typical discussion section of a preclinical says this drug shows clinical promise, which absolutely means practically nothing. Introductions are typically written after the experiments are done to make it seem, that people reconstruct their priors, their Bayesian priors, when they write the introductions to make it seem like they got an interesting result. So, actually, the idea of what I'm proposing is that you actually are getting people to formalize their prediction in a very kind of explicit way, and they get the luxury of assigning subjective probabilities. So it's one thing to say a drug is going to cause, 20% response rates in cancer patients, but you get the wiggle room of saying 20%, I have 20% confidence that this is actually going to come to pass. So you can actually, you're forecasting an event, but assigning a subjective probability, which is a level of transparency about the person's belief that astronomically exceeds what is in the typical research report. So that's the idea. And then, of course, when the trial is run, you get an opportunity to see whether or not their forecasts have actually materialized.
To answer your question from the perspective of what we do, I think the beauty of, again, what David Henry and the Australians pioneered and others have adopted, including us, is that we have tried to ensure against and strip away any possibility of any individual contributor's potential biases coming through in what we write and how we review things. So the fact that we have 3 independent reviewers, not 1, not 2, the fact that this is not a subjective off the cuff, this is terrible or this is wonderful, but follows a set list of systematic criteria. I mean, if you think about it, if you reflect on my slide of those 10 criteria, it's possible, but it's difficult to inject your biases when you're asking questions about did it quantify harms and benefits? Did it do so in absolute terms? Did it have an independent perspective? Many of these are yes/no answers. I wouldn't say, I don't think David Henry or any of the others who've worked on any of these 6 global efforts would say that these criteria are necessarily perfect, but We've been doing it for 10 years and no one has come forward with anything to replace them. So imperfect though it may be, I think that we've tried to ensure, and I hope you'd see it that way, against any individual biases entering into what we write or how we review things.
Thank you.
Hi, I also have two questions. One is for health news reviews. I was curious, it might have been embedded in one of your criteria, but I didn't see a criterion about making sure that the study is put in context of other studies on the same topic. And, you know, I've spoken to the Association of Healthcare Journalists, has a program at NLM, and this year I also spoke to them at PCORI. And the journalists always want to know, how do I use clinicaltrials.gov to find a story? And the stories they always want, the easy ones are the scandals, you know, who's hiding results, so that I can point them to. But for an individual clinical trial, I guess my stance is that usually the results of a single clinical trial aren't particularly newsworthy. Like they're only newsworthy in the embedded within essentially a systematic review of other data. So is that one of your criteria, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's there. It's not immediately evident to you because of how I condensed that list of the 10 criteria, but we go into considerable depth in how we actually apply each of those criteria. And the one about putting the new into the context of alternatives also does ask our reviewers to reflect on whether in reporting on the new research, you looked back at any other research in this field. And so stories will be dinged if they treat an isolated study as if it is, as we so often see, as if it's Moses bringing the tablets down from the mountaintop. To mix biblical metaphors here, we need to...
sense of most newspaper stories, including the New York Times, where I usually see, like, you know, the On Health column, like, 9 Norwegian runners, you know, ate bananas before they ran, and they had a better outcome. I don't know, that seems kind of common. And it's always Norwegian, I don't know why.
You know, and I should mention, although it was not one of the 6 global efforts that I talked about, many of you are probably familiar with an outstanding effort in the UK called Behind the Headlines that NHS funds. Takes a somewhat different approach. So they often use what is in the news as their peg to and then they kiss that off in brief and then quickly get into great depth in evaluating the underlying science that the story is based upon. We do it slightly differently. We are trying to lift all ships by trying to improve the media message, but in so doing, we can't help but and want to comment on the quality of the underlying science as well. So I think that we're quite complementary.
Thank you. That's about science. I'm wondering if it seems like the obvious place for the public to get involved is you can't have clinical trials without human volunteers. And it seems to me that one potential message is don't be in a clinical trial unless the following conditions are met, and it's sort of like a participant's Bill of Rights. And I know that's a sensitive topic because people have the misconception that it's helpful to them to be in a clinical trial in general, but it seems like that's the place to be, that to literally tell people, do not volunteer for this trial until you get assurance that the following conditions are met.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And Ian Chalmers has written a really good piece, actually, to patients, advising them on the things that they should look for before enrolling in a clinical trial. We ran a survey. It was only in the UK, but I think it would be quite interesting to run it here too. We ran a survey of using the big patient umbrella organisations of people's willingness to be involved in a clinical trial. And what it showed was that if I know that the results are going to be used to inform future understanding of my condition and future treatments of my disease, I'm much more likely to get involved in a clinical trial. And that was a really useful thing for us to have in our armoury, because you can imagine the minute we launched all trials, the first thing everybody said was, oh, you know, that was the pharmaceutical company response was, oh, you're going to reduce enrollment rates in clinical trials. So, yeah, absolutely.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Anders Wittfeldt. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at Metrics. I am Norwegian, but not a runner nor a banana eater. So, my question is for Professor Switzer. Regarding something you said, which is that the most common problem in observational research reporting is that people use causal language to describe the findings. I'm going to tell you why I think this is a fundamentally misguided philosophy to point out, and I want to hear your comments about that. Any observational study you do is trying to find a causal effect. That's the only reason anyone would do a study like that. No one would be interested in knowing about the correlation, for example, between eating nuts and how long you live, unless they were wondering if they eat nuts, will they live longer? So that's the reason the studies are done, and you cannot hide that by banning the causal language. The public, if they are told about a study about the correlation between eating nuts and living longer, are fully capable themselves of getting to the causal conclusions that are implied by even asking that question. So if you ban the language, the only thing you can achieve is muddying the waters and making it harder to understand what's actually going on. So what we should require is not banning causal language, it's requiring them to be more honest about the uncertainty of the conclusions. So I just want to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree with you entirely, and there's nothing in what I'm saying that calls for a ban. And I would invite you to look at anything that we've written that comments on what we think is misreporting of the results of observational studies, because we always try to, and if we miss this, we should address it. We always try to comment explicitly on the need to include language about limitations, some caveats, some explanation to the lay reader. And in fact, although it's not perfect, it's often hard to show an impact of your work in this field, because there's such turnover that journalism is just such a shifting target. You are constantly dealing with new people thrown into this beat without any training, and others retire or move on to the sports beat or becoming wedding planners or whatever. This is true. But one organization that we never try to bash anyone. I always try to frame this as constructive, positive outreach. I wouldn't do this for 10 years if I didn't think that we were helping people. But one outlet that was consistently pretty bad now uses boilerplate, not perfect, but boilerplate language that I know we influenced whenever they report on observational studies. And we are much kinder to them because they're at least acknowledging what we ought to acknowledge about almost any study, that the limitations section is important to pay attention to.
David, can I just add a quick comment to that, which is we're on a bit of a mission now at Sense About Science to get researchers to own their uncertainties and to explain those, because for two reasons. One is for the benefits of communicating the research. I mean, you know, somebody asked the question earlier about politicized issues of research. Well, of course, what keeps happening is that the other side gets to out you on the basis of unpicking, I mean, you see it in climate very much so, but on the basis of unpicking your uncertainty and exposing it. So it's far better to own it and explain it. And I think that goes for the politicians who present their government-commissioned research, need to own and explain the uncertainties there quite often too. The other reason is that if we all do a bit of that, we will continue to build the stock of public understanding of what research actually is, that it isn't a yes-no answer to things, but it's about, this is the best we know, and what would you have us do? And I think that's a much more adult conversation that we want to have going on in our society about research, rather than the ping-pong of yes-no.
I also, just briefly to your question, want to include, we don't always say this, but I try to include some mention of this, that we wouldn't be where we are today with our public health impact and warnings about tobacco, were it not for observational studies. We wouldn't be where we are today with our knowledge of the risk-benefit ratio of Vioxx without early observational data. So we try to note that as well. One other thing is we don't just review and critique, but we have a site that needs a lot of work, frankly, but it's as good as anything I've seen out there, that is a toolkit. We have an upper navigational bar. If you pull down, you'll find a toolkit of very brief primers. It would be very elementary to any of you. But our one on does your language fit the evidence, association versus causation, probably goes into more depth than anything else.
Can I add?
Go ahead.
The other thing I want to say is that very often kinds of results that are reported make their way through the public and also through to Congress and to members of Congress, and we often see bills and all sorts of attempts at legislating medical activities or screening or all sorts of other things and attacks on evidence that we have to go up to Capitol Hill and counter. So all of this is really very important and also very political.
Thank you. My name is Rins Benedictus. I'm from the University Medical Center Utrecht in the Netherlands. I'm here as a policy advisor, but I used to work as a press information officer. So I'm one of the guys who drafted the press releases with the catchy headlines and being guilty of a lot of the things Gary Switzer discussed. So, sorry. However, in this debate about bad medical news reporting, a lot of the blame typically goes to lazy journalists and opportunistic press information officers. However, in my experience, academics have their responsibility as well. I have had a brain researcher refusing to include the fact that he found his interesting thing in the brain in only 10 persons. I've had a sports medicine professor refusing to include the absolute effect size of his intervention. So these are the debates you have, and there is a very strong responsibility for academics as well. How do you reflect on that, Mr. Switzer? Where do you think what is the most important source of all these wrongs and inaccuracies?
Yeah, well, some of you have been around me even during hallway talks in the past 2.5 days are tired of this food chain analogy, but I like it because I draw a picture in my mind of it being contaminated at different levels. And look, I'm a lifelong journalist, and so I try to improve from within the journalism industry, but here I am invited to speak at this conference, and I'm honored and humbled to have that opportunity. Many times I'll say, I'll work to clean up journalism, let's have healthcare and science clean up its act. But you're absolutely right. Believe me, we have our hands full. I don't mind telling you that the ratio of news releases submitted, so I have one woman who works a couple hours a day every morning looking for eligible healthcare news releases to submit to the back end of our site to be triaged for assignment. So the ratio of those submitted to actually reviewed is something like 15-1. And we're the only such, I can't say the only such effort, our German counterparts with the mediendoctor.de have begun reviewing healthcare news releases, but the last time I checked, they've only done a handful. We're approaching 100. So you can see 15-1 of news releases eligible to what gets reviewed. News stories on any given day maybe 7 to 8 to 10-1. So you can count you can't count the gray hairs, but I'm not going to get there in my lifetime to try to improve where else the fault lies, where else improvement can be achieved. But that's where you all can, and that's where perhaps we can work together. But I take your point. It's valid, it's multifaceted, it happens at many different stages, and let's try to attack it together.
Hello, my name is Flavio D'Abramo. I came from Germany. I work in a university hospital in Berlin, and I do empirical ethics with stakeholders involved in clinical trials and biobanking. Well, my first question is for Annette Barcoin, and I would like to ask you, what do you think of this new kind of movement that it's not probably a movement, it's more an inner dynamic in oncology, that it's psycho-oncology, and what do you think of these reforms of comprehensive cancer centers? And if you have any clue on these measures about quality of life, and if they can improve cancer research, for instance. And
comprehensive cancer centers, is that the question? What do I think about
sorry?
The question is, what do I think about comprehensive cancer centers and their impact on
Yeah,
research and
exactly, yeah. And
well,
sorry, another for Gary Schweitz, quickly. And what do you think we can do to face the problem of these endpoints, surrogate endpoints? Because these endpoints were proposed from some institutions and within some policies to face some so-called life-threatening diseases. And that's it, yeah.
Why don't you go first?
Comprehensive cancer centers, at least in the United States, have been around for quite some time, and some of them are excellent, and some of them are part of the big business of cancer. And the big business of cancer is really big, and we have to distinguish between what's really perpetuating careers in business and profits to what's really creating healthy and best practices and healthier populations and quality of life work. And we're very interested in quality of life. I mean, that's really important. I mean, the general public, or the 3% of oncology patients that go into clinical trials, people are really interested in helping, and they'll accept all sorts of toxicities and all sorts of really awful things that happen to them, if with the promise that science is moving forward and that good questions are being asked and that ultimately we're going to be getting somewhere. And they'll even accept a certain level of compromise in quality of life. But for example, we were involved, in testifying to Congress about the trial of Avastin and its application to metastatic breast cancer, and we definitely testified against the approval and for the rescinding of the accelerated approval that had been given, because the confirmatory trials did not confirm anything, and the quality of life was really bad. And we were vilified for that, but ultimately the FDA did rescind for the first time that accelerated approval. So those things are really important.
Can I ask for you to go into detail about whether you have any views about what role advocates should be playing within the comprehensive cancer centers? I know they usually have them on the review committees, but do you think that do you think there's some way in which the comprehensive cancer centers should be maybe more transparent, or what role do you think the advocacy community has in
our position is that educated advocates should be sitting at all the tables where decisions are being made about, in our case, breast cancer. So yes, all over the place. In making decisions, it's only going to make the work better and bring the right kinds of questions, the right kinds of perspectives, and probably, surprisingly, are going to say the kinds of things that people wouldn't expect advocates and patients to say, that we don't want X, Y, and Z, that these expenses and going into these directions are not necessary. Whereas, coming from a different perspective, those assumptions may be made about what patients and advocates really need and want. So I think it's really important.
My answer to the question about surrogate markers is briefly very similar to the one that I made about observational studies. First of all, remember, we're reviewing the quality of the journalism. What is the journalism, or what are the other media messages conveying? And whether you agree with it or not, our stake in the ground is to say that news stories about surrogate markers that do not include some discussion of what that may or may not mean are incomplete. It is very easy to put this in easily understandable terms about, are these markers, are these the endpoints we really care about? Do we really care about having people be obsessed about their LDL cholesterol number changing from 3 months ago to now, or do we care about conveying what long-term research has shown about reduction in heart attacks or mortality? It comes up so often that we actually struggle sometimes with where to apply our criticism. If you think about our 10 criteria, it could apply in the evaluating the quality of the evidence criterion. It often could apply in the disease-mongering criteria. And it becomes bastardized, frankly, when you see media organizations get involved in promotional campaigns, often the Know Your Numbers campaigns, which whip the worried well into a frenzy and never explain that the numbers that we now have people obsess over may not have any meaningful impact in their life. So, good question, though.
Go ahead.
Eric Turner with Oregon Health and Science University, and maybe this has already been said before with the food chain, in case I missed the point of that, but Dr. Schweitzer, but I guess this could be for several of you. I wonder, it seems to me that we got, what do we do about this, what seems to be a predilection, a problem with the human predilection or preference for splashy findings at either level, either the level of what scientists are doing, or and how we're communicating with our own within our own communities to our peers through peer-reviewed journals, and lots of novelty and leading to lots of citations. On the other hand, if you do perhaps a quote boring replication study, then maybe it's not going to attract the same number of eyeballs. It's not going to maybe not get the same. It won't be deemed as newsworthy. Perhaps not get recognized by a journal as perhaps moving the field forward. What's this doing? It seems to be that there's this preference for things to be reported in a very positive light or a very negative light, and nuances doesn't seem to be very popular. If you try to communicate something that, well, something is less effective than we used to think it was, then there seems to be a morphing of that message into it's totally ineffective, or if something is not quite as safe as we used to think it was, then it's completely unsafe and horribly dangerous. So the nuances get lost, it seems, in the search or the incentives. Maybe it comes back to incentives for whether it be citations or recognition or newsworthiness. If you're a reporter, you might be looking for, what's going to attract eyes to my news story. Just what can we do given that we're up against that?
Well, I think we need to applaud, and I left this out of my talk. I'm talking squarely out of both sides of my mouth here. We are seeing at one and the same time some of the best healthcare journalism that we've ever seen in this country and perhaps globally. And I picture that as these periodic peaks of excellence. But the valleys in between these peaks are becoming wider and deeper. I call it the daily drumbeat of dreck that may overwhelm the good that's done of these peaks of excellence. So we try to shine a light on the excellence. We have a couple in this room. I think there's still Christy Ashwanden here. If you haven't met her, I hope she knows how highly I think of her work. Cuts through black and white and paints eloquent pictures in tones of gray as well as anyone in this country. And I love her work. And she is, to the best of my knowledge, self-trained and should be a model. And so keep it up and get cloned, Christy. Richard Harris of NPR was here earlier, and not only Richard, but so many of his colleagues. I hope they know how highly I think of them. So we need to hold them up as models because, 42 years ago, I got my first job in TV news and wanted to be a sports reporter in Milwaukee. But ahead of me was a former All-Pro Green Bay Packer, now on the air, the voice of the Green Bay Packers on the air, the dean of Wisconsin Sportscasters, and a current Milwaukee Brewer baseball player. So I was going to be fifth string at most, when one day the news director literally tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Kid, we know you probably want to be on the air, and here's your chance, and nobody else wants it. We're going to start a medical news beat, and nobody else wants it because nobody wants to deal with doctors every day." So the gun was to my head, and for all the wrong reasons, I took it, and I will never look back with any regrets because I think it's the most important beat in all of journalism. But unfortunately, the reason I tell you that story is that's still the way so many people get thrown into this beat today, and they need help. And so role models like some I've just pointed out, Eric, is one way that we can show that nuance, gray can be colorful and beautiful, and it is indeed the color tone that we need to educate the public.
Perhaps we can describe Christie's work as in full Technicolor rather than shades of grey. But the thing that the question, I think, raises some alarm bells for me on, and I'm sure the question didn't mean it like this, but I think the world is full of counsels of despair about how difficult it is to get things across to the public, the media, politicians. And I've heard so many excuses about things that tend to sort of do mass psychology on the public or the media, and they say, well, no, everyone's interested in a bad news story, they're not interested in a good news story. Well, that's BS. People will tell you, well, we're much more interested in spotting patterns. Yeah, that's true. We definitely like to spot patterns in things. You know, I ate that banana, I ran that mile, whatever. Yeah, that's true. But that's the world we live in, right? And within that world, we've got to function to get better stories across. And I feel that it doesn't help us any to spend time doing kind of cod psychology on the media or the public about what they will and won't tolerate. I think it's much better to go out there and experiment and find a much more imaginative approach, because it is easy, actually, to repose some of these issues and to set the agenda. There are lots of incredibly interesting old untold stories. We've heard many of them over the last 48 hours. That will attract people's attention and help them to understand things. And I think it's just not a helpful path for us to go down. And I would just warn you against being inclined towards those the public always does, the public always thinks kind of responses.
Thanks. Okay, we have time for just 2 more questions. So, John?
Thank you very much. First of all, I really applaud all the efforts you guys are making and the people you represent. It's wonderful. I'm suggesting also another way, an approach. In 2000, with Teddy Dickerson there, the two of us hauled 9 drug company executives into the O'Hare Hilton, what a pit, and spent the whole day arguing with them on humanitarian grounds to allow the registration of their trials. And they said, to summarize, it'll be a cold day in hell before that ever happens. That was 2000 in April. In 2003, I phoned Teddy and said, we're going to write a review and an editorial at the same time on for one group of people only, and that is medical editors, because I had had a call from an editor at the New England Journal said, I simply don't understand why the registration of trials is an important issue. We published that. It was used repeatedly in various motions for the AMA and so on and so forth. But what was important was what happened in a quite different sphere, and this is never really mentioned. My hero, Elliot Spitzer, who was at that time the Attorney General for the state of New York, suddenly brought suit on the question of whether suicide or not was precipitated in kids by selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. He brought suit because he said, I don't know a damn thing about the scientific points here, but I do know that a grieving mother shouldn't have to think there were unpublished data around when my kid was given that. That's wrong. It took 5 days or a week before 4 or 5 drug companies said, we were going to register all the time, we will register our drug trials. Later than that, the journals started saying, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors said, basically, we were going to demand registration all the time. They'd been under pressure for years on this. Well, that happened. But the point was the lawsuit. And so I'm suggesting, as a crude but scientific method, do what used to be called, when I was playing a lot of rugby, kick them in the goalies. Get the lawyers at it. The class action suit, if you've got unregistered trials, get on it.
Thanks. Last question.
This a very short point. My name's Trevor Butterworth. I've met some of you in the last 2 days. I'm Director of Sense About Science in the US, and I promise you that I'm the only non-American accent among the Sense About Science team here in the US. But what I wanted to thank the panel for, I think, a really important dimension, bringing a really important dimension to all these debates. I wanted to also, Gary beat me to thanking Christy, because that was going to be an intro to a point that I want everybody to take away. I often think my background is a whole mixture of arts and humanities subjects, but I ended in intellectual history, and it was great to hear Gramsci and Bourdieu mentioned yesterday. But I often think about how will future historians look back at this particular moment in terms of the history of ideas. And I'd like to think that meetings like this will crop up in the history books as turning points in the way we thought about knowledge and we thought about how to improve the state of knowledge. I cannot emphasize that you have many allies out there in the data collaborative movement, in the open government movement, and all of these can be mobilized and need to be mobilized together to bring about a cultural and social shift. And finally, one of those examples of that cultural and social shift are two of the people in this room, Kristen Sanini and Regina Nuzzo, who have volunteered to work with our project with the American Statistical Association to improve statistical literacy in science and society. So I urge you all to get involved in those kinds of projects. Academics can reach across the divide, connect with journalists and connect with public, and become a future source of future media that can hold a quantified world accountable. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the comment. I'm going to just take my prerogative to make one last comment, which is we've talked a lot about journalism in terms of public media, but actually many more people watch popular television. I used to do consulting for a TV show called ER, and it was very striking how the fact that when you talk to news producers, they don't know anything about science, and that TV show had a whole stream of physicians working on it, and the showrunner was somebody doing his residency in pediatrics while he was, Neil Baer, while he was doing it, had ER docs working on it. So I think there's more room through popular culture as well that we really haven't taken very much advantage of, that we also need to be thinking about. So thanks for a fabulous panel. You guys did a terrific job. Thank you very much.